Hello and welcome back to this cute Design Studio tutorial series. Last time we took a look at Design Studio and imported our artwork across from Photoshop. Now for this video we're going to go in and animate one of these dials in detail, and then in the next video we'll recap this process with the other two dials before moving on. But first, as I mentioned in the last video, we need to add the fonts to the project. In the end we want this to run on a device, so for that we actually need the fonts in the local project folder in order to deploy them to that device. So what we're going to do is use the QML font loader and bring the fonts into our project folder. So let's do that by clicking here on the File menu and then New File, and in File and Classes, in QML Files we have the font loader. So if we choose this, we have to give the component a name, so I'm just going to give it the name of the font. And then we have to browse to the copy of the font that we want to bring into the Design Studio. Now we browse to the font and open it here. And we left our import path as the default. Now we need to repeat this process for our two other fonts. Now we can use these fonts in our project. Now to do this, first we need to actually call them manually in the code. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this default UI QML file that was generated when we created our project and use this as a little bit of a sketchpad. So all we do is we come into the code and we manually call an instance of each of these font loader components that we've just created. And you notice here that the names are auto-completing. Now we can select these objects and look at the properties, and we see the correct name for that font that we need to use in the Design Studio. So let's go back to our main file, go into one of the components, and change all of the fonts in the component. So if we highlight the text object and scroll down, we find the font name. And here we just replace it with the name that we found from calling the component manually, and there we have the correct font. Now you might need to also manually select the weight for that font. So like in this case, we change the name to the correct font and then we choose the correct weight. And there we have the correct font as well. So we do this for each of our text layers, changing the name and also maybe the weight, until we have the correct fonts in our project. Now, of course, we need to do this for the numbers. So we do that in exactly the same way, just by selecting one of the number text items, renaming it, and choosing the correct weight. And repeat this process across however many text objects you have in your project. Okay, so with that in place, let's create a timeline. We do that by clicking on the plus in the timeline panel, and let's rename our timeline to something related to our component. Now we're going to set the end frame, or the duration, to 1100, because it's an easy range to map in the future to the values from our backend. There are lots of ways we could do that, but we're choosing the simplest way in order to prototype with. And what we need to do next is just click on the Create Animation button. And for now, we're just going to uncheck the running option because we want it to be data-driven from our JavaScript simulation, so we don't need to worry about any other settings for now. Okay, so with our timeline in place, what we want to do is rotate this needle through the full range of our dial from the 11 to the 0. So what we need to do is drag in an item from the Qt Quick Basics. And we're going to use this as a center of rotation to rotate our needle around. So we're going to take this needle here and drag the item just below it in the hierarchy, and then we need to position it where we want it to rotate around. So we'll center it up here. And we're going to make this needle item, this needle image, a child of the item. And now we're going to set a beginning and end keyframe for this timeline with a rotation value. So at the beginning of the timeline, it's rotated all the way around to the 0, and at the end of the timeline, it's rotated all the way up to the 11, which is the full range of our gauge. So we set the record keyframe, then we just have to fiddle with the rotation value until we figure out where the beginning of our timeline is. So somewhere like there looks good, and then all the way to the end, and we do the same process here, and that looks good too. Okay, so we can turn the record button off, and if we scrub through the timeline, we see our needle is rotating with the item around the arc of the gauge. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is replace this arc item that we generated from Photoshop with a Studio component. So let's do that by clicking on the Studio component flow tag, which is going to automatically import the library that we need with the Studio components in it. Now inside here we have an item called an arc, and we're going to use that to replace the original artwork in order that we can dynamically change its color, length, beginning, end positions, which we need to do in order to animate this gauge. So let's start by dragging this onto the scene, and we're going to drag it into the navigator again, and we want to find a position where it's underneath the needle but still on top of the background track so that it has the right Z position in our composition here. And then we just need to drag it out so it matches the size, width, stroke width, and we need to find these beginning and end points in order to match up with our artwork as we had it in Photoshop. So this can be a little bit fiddly. You just have to play around with the values until it really fits with what you're trying to replace. So here we set the width of the stroke, and sometimes we'll need to refresh the scene using the refresh button at the top here. And as you can see now, the arc is actually underneath our artwork that we're replacing. So let's drag it up to the top. So it's on top. And then we're going to figure out where these beginning and end points are. Okay, and we can just change the background color so that we can get a clearer look of what's going on while we're fine-tuning the details of this arc. Now, once we have everything in correct position, we can remove our original artwork through the edit menu here and just delete it because we don't need that anymore. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to animate the end position of this arc so that it follows the needle and it is always at the same place as the needle at every position on the timeline. So a good way to do this is just make sure we remember this end value number, hit the record button, take the beginning and create a keyframe at the beginning of the timeline where both values are the same and they're the beginning value, so there's no arc to be seen. And then we scrub all the way along to the end and we just put back the end number that we had just a minute ago. And there we have our complete arc at the top of the gauge. So if we turn the record button off, you can see here as we scrub through the timeline that now the arc and the needle move together and the arc follows the needle. Now what we want to do is make sure that they're really tight together and there's no overlap or gap between the arc and the needle itself. In order to do that, we're going to skip through this timeline, stopping at all of the major frame intervals, so every 100 frames, and just make sure that the needle and the arc are close together, and if they're not, then we're going to add a keyframe and just adjust the value of the arc's end position so that there is no gap and it does not overlap with the needle. So we just bring the end position back a little bit until we can't see it anymore. Move on to the next 100th frame and repeat the process, adding as many keyframes as we need in order to keep that animation very tight together. Okay, so let's just speed this up and repeat the process all the way around until we're really confident that these animations match up nicely. Okay, now what we want to do is actually make sure that the numbers and the dots that we have here for the markers line up perfectly with our frames. So we're going to go back to these 100th frames, to the first 100, 200, 300 frames, and at each of these markers we're going to manually align the dot, the indicator dot and the number, and we're just going to line these up optically. So we start here with the first dot, and we just line it up, and we can also adjust our artwork layers here as well, so we can make this a little bit bigger and give it a bit more space for the dots and the numbers to go around it. So let's just turn the background into a nice black background so that we can really see clearly what we're doing here. And we're just going to manually adjust the digits until they look right to us. And we go along to the next 100 frame and repeat the process, aligning the dots and the numbers each time so that we know that at each frame value, which is the important accurate value, that everything else lines up to that frame value. Okay, great. So now all of our numbers and indicator dots line up perfectly with the frame value that we need for this gauge. Now what we want to do is add a color animation for our arc so that the arc changes color depending on the position on the timeline. So for the first third, we have a green color, and then we have an orange color in the middle, and then a red color at the end. Now in order to do this, we just come back to the beginning of the timeline. And we've got some colors here on the text pad. So let's grab the first one of these. We enter the color into the stroke color, turn on the record keyframe button, and add a keyframe with our green color. Now what we want to do is go up to, say, 4 or I don't know, maybe 500 frames, and then go back 1 to frame 499, where we're going to add a second keyframe with the green value. So this is so that the colors don't fade, but they switch instantly from one frame to the next to a new color. So then once we've added the second green keyframe, we can go forward 1 frame, grab the next color, and we add a new keyframe with this new color at the 500 frame mark. And there we have it, a transition between green to orange. We repeat the process, adding another keyframe at 799 with orange, and then at the 800 frame we switch to the red color, and then finally a final keyframe at the end. So now our arc, as we animate through the timeline, changes color depending on the position of the needle in the arc. So we can turn the record button off for now. And the next thing we want to do is replace this outer ring with a pie element, a pie studio component, so that we can also change the color of the outside ring to match the color of the arc. So in order to do this, we're going to drag a pie component, and again we're going to put it into the scene, and we don't want it to be a child of anything, so let's use the arrow key to move that out of the hierarchy, so it's now back at the base of the hierarchy again, which is where we want it. And right now it's at the very top of our scene, which is fine. So we're just going to line up the position again and match up with our original artwork. So we get the same width and height. We'll set this endpoint to 360, and then we'll just adjust the stroke width so it roughly matches up with what we had in our original design. There we go, that looks fine. Okay, so now we have to look for the original artwork because we're going to delete that as we don't need it anymore. So that's this layer here. Let's just hit edit and delete, remove it from our scene, and we can turn this pie back on. And now we're just going to repeat the process that we've just done for the arc and animate the colors across the timeline so that they match up exactly with the colors on the arc. So we'll turn the record button back on, copy our green color again, and start by creating a keyframe right at the beginning. And we're just going to repeat this process exactly as we did before. Okay, so now our arc and our pie item change color at the same time as the needle rotates up through the gauge. Great, so let's turn the record button off. One final set of animations we want to do is to make these numbers scale up as the needle passes over them and change colour as well. So for the very first number, we're going to start by going into the Advanced tab and adjusting the scale at the very beginning and also setting the colour for the text item at the 0 keyframe. Now we're just going to move a little bit further ahead in the timeline. And add another keyframe with exactly the same values. So this is how long it stays scaled up and coloured. And then we're going to skip along another 10 frames where we drop the scale back down and drop the colour back down to its original colour. Like so. Okay, so this is our first number animation. But for the rest of these numbers, apart from the last one, we actually want them to be able to look the same regardless of whether the needle is going forwards or backwards. So for these ones, we're going to do it slightly differently. We're going to go to the 100 frames and scroll along in our timeline until we find it. Okay, and we just bring up our colours again. We're going to make a set of keyframes around this 100 frame mark where we want the scale and the colour effect to be active, to be on. So we want it to be scaled up and recoloured to the green colour. And these go around the 100 frame marks. And then before and after these 2 frames, we're going to add in another frame, another keyframe where the values are reset again. Okay, so now we have the color animated. We need to repeat the process for the scale. So what we can do is we can use these little arrows to move between the keyframes of our color animation, and at the same time we can just insert keyframes for the scale. So we want one of the original scale and then another one where it's scaled up, and then we insert a keyframe with the scaled up, and then we insert another one with the original scale. So now it scales up and changes color and in both directions. So with this one now, what we can do in order to copy and paste that across to all our other numbers is just come here and in the context menu, copy all keyframes from item. And we go on to this, and in the context menu again, we go down to timeline and paste all keyframes to item. This duplicates all of our keyframes, and we can just scrub the playhead to the next range and drag these keyframe block along. And now we'll have the same animation on the second number. So let's repeat this process all the way up the timeline. And one thing we're going to do is we're going to come in and we're going to change the colors for the color animation of the numbers at each of the appropriate keyframes where the arc and the pie also change color. So here we do that. We can just select the keyframes and in the context menu of each keyframe change the color. Once again, change the color of the the text when it's scaled up. And for the very last one, we're going to repeat what we did for the first one, but just in inverse. So we'll have this ending frame where it's scaled up and red. And then that way, as the playhead moves up and down, as the animation moves back and forth, it will always scale up to this final instance. And then as the playhead moves back down again, it'll scale back down and pass the animations in the right order, going the other way. Okay, so if we zoom back out and see, we can see all of our animation here, our whole timeline. And we can scrub through and see what we've made. Okay, so the last thing we want to do is we need to export a property as an alias from our timeline. Now, if you don't see your timeline, you need to go and click on the filter icon and deselect the Show Only Visible Items option. Now you should see your timeline with all of your keyframes in the navigator view. So just select the timeline itself, and in the top right in the properties, we're going to take the current frame and we're just going to export that as an alias. Now if we go to the root item of our component and into the Properties tab, we see here that's the property that we have exported as an alias. So let's give it a new name. We'll just call it RPM frame. Save the project. Now if you go back up one layer to the main view, and we can see here that our component has been updated. And if we highlight the component here in the navigator, then this property that we exported as an alias is available to us. So we can actually set the current frame of our dial with this property here. Now later on, we're going to use the data from our JavaScript simulation to access this current frame in order to control the animation of our UI. Okay, so I think this is a good place to stop for now. Next time we're going to come back in, we're going to repeat the process with the other two gauges, and we're going to look at also creating some effects while we do it. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.